Today's the day all of us have been waiting for. Nvidia is launching the RTX 3000 series graphics card, so from today on, there will be brand new graphics cards available on the market with a brand new design, brand new features, and most importantly, more performance. Now, we've all seen the video from Jensen's Kitchen a few weeks ago, and we heard all about how much better these new cards are supposed to be, but it is always hard to completely believe that until put it on a bench and start seeing those numbers for yourself, right? And I'm just gonna go right ahead here and spoil this video for you guys. He was not wrong. But next to those pure performance numbers, there is actually a lot of other things that we need to talk about this time. We have to touch the state of RTX and DLSS, the performance difference between using an Intel or an AMD CPU, the impact of this card on streaming, on esports and competitive FPS games. There's the new 12-pin power cable and the new power supply requirements that are actually quite important to know. And there is the completely new cooler design, which is very interesting, but also might not work as well in every case. So if you own an ITX gaming rig, you might want to stay tuned here. So basically, I'm going to try to cover all the important details that you will need to know before going out and buying one of these cards for yourself. And trust me, you will want to buy one. Now, today I'll be going over this new Founders Edition RTX 3080 from Nvidia, which will cost you $699 in the US or 720 euros here in the EU. And I'll be covering a few partner cards starting tomorrow. So if you're interested in those, then make sure you are subscribed to my channel so you don't miss a thing. And since this is going to be a pretty long video, I will chop it up into nice little chapters and list it in the description down below, so you can just jump to the parts that you're actually interested in and skip the ones that you don't really feel like watching today. Let's go. This video is brought to you by Seasonic and their Prime series power supplies. These top quality power supplies are very efficient, they're whisper quiet, extremely reliable, and my go-to choice for most of my test rigs and builds around here. Seasonic is also the first brand to release a much nicer power cable for this Founders Edition RTX 3080, so you can just go ahead and skip on the bulky adapter that comes with the card. Check out the links in the description below to get yourself one of these power supplies, or for more information on how to get the new 12-pin power cable for free if you already have one. Design-wise, I don't think that the pictures and renders we've seen so far really do it justice. It is much more impressive in real life. It is heavy and really well built. It is made completely out of metal with a lot of surface area to help the cooling, and the finish is just beautiful. I'm sure that this design will cost Nvidia more than most other board partner coolers. The focus point of the new design is the fan configuration here. We have the left fan, which is more traditional looking, that is pushing air out through the expansion slots, like any blower style cooler would. And we have the second fan that is actually pulling air up through the heatsink and out the other way. So it requires your PC case to get rid of that heat. So, it's basically a mix between a blower cooler and an open cooler. There are some new features on the card itself. HDMI ports are now 2.1, which will let us connect high refresh rate 4K monitors to it. LG's new 4K 120Hz OLED TV, for example, that I'm actually testing right now, so keep an eye out for that one on my channel. Or even you can go for an 8K monitor if you want to. HDMI 2.1 is pretty rare to see on a monitor, but that was because there was no HDMI 2.1 PCs. And now, with these new graphics cards, as well as the new consoles that will support HDMI 2.1, I do expect we'll finally see more monitors implementing this as well. The second thing is the new 12-pin power connector, which is surprisingly tiny and definitely more attractive than having two traditional 8-pin headers. Now, at least if you didn't have to use the adapter that Nvidia includes in the box. This adapter just means that you can use it on your current power supply, but it does look a bit bulky and it's not really that great for your typical cable management. So ideally, you will want to get a new cable like the one I have from Seasonic, but I'm pretty sure that other brands will launch similar cables as well, so make sure you get one that fits your power supply. Now, I hear a lot of criticism here and there about the new adapter design, and I know that it's not perfect yet, but I'm actually quite happy that Nvidia is taking this let's call it a first step. And I do hope that these smaller, more elegant cables will become a new standard for all power supplies, and we'll get more GPUs using it in the future. So in a way, in a long run, we'll all end up with better looking systems overall. So again, it is not perfect now, and you do have to deal with the adapter and the extra cables, but it does have so much potential in my opinion. But let's move on to the chip itself. It has more GPU cores than previous models, which means more performance overall. New and improved RT and Tensor cores mean that games that are using RTX and DLSS should get even bigger performance gains. Now, the new chips should be more efficient as well, thanks to a move from a 12 nanometer TSMC process to a Samsung 8 nanometer one, and we're also getting newer, faster memory in the form of GDDR6X. So in pretty much every single way, we're looking at a straight up upgrade over the last generation of RTX cards. I will be comparing the new RTX 3080 to both RTX 2080 Super Founders Edition and the RTX 2080 Ti, which was the fastest GPU on the market until now. And I'm going to be using the factory overclocked 2080 Ti as well, because I actually don't have the Founders Edition. If you are still on a GTX 1080 Ti, remember that it will be slightly slower than the 2080 Super you will see in the graphs here. Anything below that just won't even come close to what we're looking at today. For testing, I'm using my Intel i9 10900K rig because it actually performed better than the Ryzen 9 3950X rig. And that is a separate story and a very long one too, so I will make a separate video talking about Intel versus AMD CPUs with this RTX 3080. But the short story is that even though the RTX 3080 supports PCIe Gen 4, which is only found on AMD's platform, just pure gaming performance is still better with an Intel CPU. And if you look at the graphs, you can see a clear pattern here. The RTX 3080 is consistently outperforming the much more expensive RTX 2080 Ti by a very nice margin, with a similarly priced 2080 Super way behind it. The most important thing to note here is how objectively good the results on a 4K resolution are. The RTX 3080 averages around 25% faster than the RTX 2080 Ti and around 60% faster than the 2080 Super, which is just insane. And more importantly, all games can actually be played at 4K resolution and over 60 FPS consistently on high settings. Borderlands 3, for example, went from 43 FPS on a 2080 to 55 on a 2080 Ti and now to 75 with an RTX 3080, and that is actually a huge jump in how smooth the game will actually feel. The 2080 Ti did completely fine on 4K, but sometimes came just a bit short without lowering the settings, while this RTX 3080 does it completely comfortably. 1440p is sort of similar, where the 3080 ends up around 20% faster than the RTX 2080 Ti on average, or just under 50% faster than the 2080 Super, which is another really big jump. While a lot of people didn't have or want to spend $1,200 on a 2080 Ti, quality gamers can now get a $700 GPU that will play everything at the very highest of settings with high frame rates, and they can finally make good use of those high refresh rate 1440p monitors. So even before talking about any of the other extra features, just the straight up performance increase makes this RTX 3080 a huge deal for both 4K and 1440p gamers. Now, looking at the 1080p results, the gap between the 20 and the 30 series is smaller, with the RTX 3080 averaging around 15% faster than the factory OC 2080 Ti and around 35% faster than the 2080 Super. The percentage varies per game, as only certain games are starting to get CPU limited. Far Cry 5, for example, shows basically no difference between the three cards at 1080p Ultra, but other games like Borderlands 3 or RTX titles like Metro or Control still show big improvements here. But to be honest, buying a $700 GPU for a 1080p monitor doesn't really make a lot of sense in a lot of ways, but there is one exception though, and that is competitive gaming. While we are definitely seeing some diminishing returns in the lightest of games on 1080p, like CSGO or like Overwatch and so on, the RTX 3080 here still outperforms both 2080 Super and the 2080 Ti in those games. And if you look at Call of Duty Warzone, for example, the difference is actually really significant. So if you're competing at a serious level where a single frame can make that difference between winning or losing a game, and you already have a high refresh rate, 240 Hz or even more monitor, you will actually see a big benefit from using this new card. Also, if that's you, make sure to watch my AMD versus Intel video that's coming out soon. And while we are at competitive gaming, it is actually worth mentioning that Nvidia is focusing on another new feature called Nvidia Reflex, which is meant to bring down the latency while gaming. So, getting more frames is one thing, getting each frame to your monitor faster is even more important to have that competitive advantage. And this is exactly what Reflex is supposed to do. Now, Reflex is not unique to this new card, but it's actually supported on 9 series cards and newer. So even if you have an older GTX card, you'll still get this feature. But if you don't do super competitive shooters and you like your games to look pretty and realistic instead, you will care more about ray tracing. After a pretty rough start 2 years ago with no games supporting it and a huge performance penalty for those that did, things have improved a little bit. Now we have around 24 games that do support it, which is, still not a lot, but it's going in the right direction. And with big titles like Fortnite and Cyberpunk joining in, as well as the new console supporting ray tracing, we can finally call it a feature that is, worth thinking about. From a performance perspective, things do look a bit better as well. All the RTX titles I've tested now will actually run on 4K with RTX enabled and over 60 FPS. So technically, with this 3080, some games will look better with smoother frame rates at any resolution. But there is a catch, and that is that games that rely heavily on ray tracing also rely on DLSS upscaling tech to keep them playable. Now, Nvidia marketing is focused really on RTX part, the shiny graphics and nice lights, but in my opinion, DLSS is the real MVP here. It allows games to render at a lower resolution, leading to much higher frame rates, and then uses AI to, fill in the remaining pixels. Now, the concept itself is pretty old, but DLSS has gotten so good that in most games, it has become indistinguishable from a native 4K render. In some games like Tomb Raider, you actually cannot turn on RTX without also turning on DLSS, and the DLSS gains basically hide the RTX performance hit. In other games like Control, for example, we can see the impact of DLSS on its own, and while it's really nice that I can play Control on 4K with RTX and DLSS at over 60 FPS, I would still get almost 40 FPS more if I only had DLSS on instead. So even with these new and improved RT cores on this new card, you still pay a chunky performance price for the nicer light and nicer reflections. But at the end of the day, you have an option to decide for yourself what you prefer here, RTX on or higher frame rates. Now, Nvidia is also introducing broadcast feature, which is basically the next version of RTX voice, allowing you to also filter out the background noise around you, as well as the sounds from other people talking to you. So remember that one friend with a loud mechanical keyboard that keeps annoying you all the time while gaming? You can now easily filter out his background noise instead. It is really simple to use and it's actually surprisingly effective, but it is also an early version, so you can apply the effect to all sounds you hear from one device, but it's not like you can enable it for one friend on Discord and you can disable it for another at the same time. It also has a webcam tool that you can use to remove your background completely without using a green screen, leaving only yourself and your gaming chair in view. It's still not perfect, especially around glasses and if you move around a lot. But remember that most green screen setups aren't that perfect either. Now, if you have a setup with great lighting and great camera and a great green screen, it will look much better. But for beginners or casual streamers without the right setup, this actually looks promising and it works quite well. Now, for me personally, I like a nice soft background behind a streamer, and you can now use broadcast to blur it a bit instead. Of course, it won't be the proper depth of an expensive camera setup, but it does give you a nice and a soft background that is actually pretty acceptable. Now, broadcast is also still in beta, meaning that there aren't that many options to play around with, but even in this current state, it is still worth experimenting here and there. But what about content creators? I was really curious to see if upgrading my own 2080 Super would improve my performance in Adobe Premiere, which I use to edit videos, but I actually didn't notice much of a difference. Now, working in the application itself didn't feel different because the older cards already did fine, and on the render time on one of my videos, I only saved about half a minute. Now, the 3080 was faster, but not enough to justify buying a new GPU for that use only. Now, do keep in mind, this is just for my own workflow, which is not that advanced, and it's basically, cutting and pasting clips, a bit of recoloring, and a couple of light effects and a couple of layers. So it is possible that with heavier effects, results may vary. And it is also possible that if you work in Resolve, there might be a larger impact. I personally don't use Resolve, but I understood that my friend Adam, aka Epos Fox, is going to cover that particular topic. So check him out if you're interested in that, or if you're interested in anything related to streaming, because he knows it all. I will leave a link to his channel in the description down below. While I personally didn't see a huge performance difference in Adobe Premiere, when it comes to gaming, this new RTX 3080 just crushed it. I know at least some of you assumed that Nvidia would do this by letting the new GPU draw a lot more power than before, but it's actually not the case here. So the RTX 3080 does use more power than the 2080 Super, but it actually uses less than my 2080 Ti while being considerably faster. It actually sticks really close to the TDP spec of 320 watts. And if I look at a whole system, my test rig with the i9 will usually pull around 400 to 420 watts of power from the wall while gaming, and depending on the game, of course, with occasional spikes around 600 watts. So a proper A-quality 650 watt power supply or more is what you want to be looking at for your new setup. If you want to overclock your high-end CPU or your GPU, consider a good 750 watt unit at the very least. On the other hand, my Ryzen 9 rig easily pulled 500 watts in some games, so a good 650 watt PSU is also recommended, or get a bigger one if you want to do some overclocking. While 320 watts is not bad considering the performance, it is still a lot of heat that you need to deal with, and the new GPU cooler handles that really well. In a stress test, I got 75 degrees on an open test bench with a noise level of only 38.8 decibels at 50 centimeters distance, which is actually fairly quiet. I cannot tell you how the Founders Edition compares to the aftermarket cards yet, but you can guess that these thermal results and the factory boost speed will really put a lot of pressure on cards from ASUS, MSI, Gigabyte, and so on, especially because those brands will really struggle to compete with Nvidia when it comes to price. If you plan to use this cooler in any typical tower case that can handle a 2080 Ti, you shouldn't have any problems at all. However, in some specific cases, this Founders Edition might not work as well. To prove that, I grabbed my NZXT H1, which is a really good small case for many reasons, but the GPU is positioned in such a way that the right fan is stuck against a closed piece of metal and the left fan is blowing air down against the table. Now, while gaming with the 3080 FE in the H1, GPU temps went up to 85 degrees and the card started to throttle. The fan started blowing really hard and the GPU slowed down to around 1725 MHz. So, if you're looking at an unusual case design that will close off the second fan, this Founders Edition card just won't do and you will have to get something else. And I think that was enough for one day. I'm really sorry for making such a long video, but at least the conclusion will be pretty short. I really like the new RTX 3080, I like the performance of it, I like the new design, I like the new features, and in the end, nothing on the market today comes close to what this has to offer at any price. When 2080 launched, they got a lot of criticism for not being faster than the 1080 Ti, and while the 2080 Ti performed really well, it was just way too expensive. And now this 3080 is making a huge jump over the 2080 Ti with enough performance to really play all games at 4K resolution on max settings or Quad HD resolution with everything turned up and high refresh rates in AAA titles. and you get all that for $700. It is just a huge step forward for high-end PC gaming in my opinion. Now keep in mind 3090 is coming out next week, but it will cost more than twice as much and definitely won't be anywhere near twice as fast. And I know some of you will buy it anyway just because, it's faster, but we can safely assume that this 3080 will be the ultimate gaming GPU for anyone who isn't, super rich. The only real question remaining is what will AMD do with their new GPUs in October, but as much as I like AMD and Ryzen CPUs, I just don't see them challenging Nvidia and this 3080 just yet. I really hope I'm wrong, as competition is always good, but I wouldn't hold my breath for anything better to come out at this price point anytime soon. Now, thank you so much for sticking along and watching this whole video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give me a like and subscribe to this channel to never miss an upload. Bye guys, see you in the next one.